His book was Global Financial Warriors from a number of years ago, but he's been really writing up on the deficit and on this financial crisis. We're thrilled to have back John Taylor of Stanford University. Professor, good noon to you.
Be here, Tom.
John Taylor, when you look at all this, we are now at the end of QE2. Do you have confidence that we can directionally unwind the balance sheet of our ever-growing Federal Reserve?
Only if it's laid out in a pretty clear way how they're going to do it. I think now there's a great deal of uncertainty. The balance sheet is so big. How are they going to do it? What's the speed? So I've been arguing that they lay out more of a strategy that they're going to follow as they reduce the balance sheet. I think that would be helpful if they did that.
John, I want to bring up one of your recent op-eds as you talked about the spirit and courage of Paul Volcker. Volcker and his colleagues, this is in the late 70s, early 80s, were resolute, and their efforts paid off. Inflation slowed dramatically, which set the stage for 2 decades of strong economic growth. We're not there now. This is very, very different. Why do we need the same courage that we saw in a high-yield time?
I think we have to have the courage to really stick with the kind of monetary policy that worked then, quite frankly. You know, the recovery from the recession in 81, 82 was more than 2 times more rapid than the recovery from this most recent recession. And I think it reflected a move away from very discretionary interventionist policies in the 70s. And I think that resoluteness that Volcker brought helped that. And I think now we've also seen such amount of intervention, stimulus, QE1, QE2, a whole range of new programs. And I think we need to get back to what I would call sound monetary policy. And by the way, sound fiscal policy. I heard a little bit of your previous discussion.
Right.
I think that's equally important.
John Taylor, here's a 2-year yield, folks. The headline, Taylor considers quantitative restriction. So there's a 2-year yield, and down we go. We got our lower yields. I mean, absolutely remarkable, 0.34, 0.35%. Professor Taylor, when you see the 2-year yield action, that's not in any of your textbooks, is it?
It's really unusual, and it reflects, I think, quite a bit of weakness in the economy. It's remarkable. You know, the recession has ended 2 years ago. We've had 2 years of recovery, but it's almost a recovery in name only. And so that weakness is still there, and I think that's one of the reasons why the yields are so low.
Do you support Professor McKinnon at Stanford that we should raise the target rate right now?
I think we should be preparing for that. I think the main implication of things like the so-called Taylor rule is that we shouldn't have another quantitative easing. And to lay out a strategy that's pretty clear about what's going to happen with the balance sheet and with the federal funds rate. I think that would be constructive. Whether you get started right away or you prepare the way, I think preparing the way is most important. And
we go academic on you folks. You heard John Taylor with that shameless plug for the so-called Taylor rule. Here it is on the Bloomberg, T-A-Y-L, go. Look at this equation down there. It's enough to put anybody watching to sleep with Oken factor. How cool is that? John Taylor, if you look at this Bloomberg screen, there's a real debate about how to interpret your rule. How should we interpret your rule? Is it accurate now, or do you put a big asterisk next to it like you do with Barry Bonds?
I think you go back to the original, just what was proposed many years ago, and which many central banks have looked at, people have investigated. So I think there's not as much debate as you might want. What happens with procedures like this is people modify it, which is quite reasonable, quite frankly. But I think the original still works, and it worked well for a long time.
John, there's such a cacophony of news flow right now, whether it's Greece and contagion, as you mentioned earlier, our fiscal crisis. What would you urge our watchers to focus on? What are you focused on as you closed out your spring term?
I think the debt talks are the most important things right now. The talks seem to break up a little bit last week, but I think there's a deal sitting on the table if they just go for it. It would basically take the $6 trillion gap between the administration and the House and narrow it down to, I recommend, 2.5. and then the rest of the 3.5 is for next year to debate.
John Taylor with us. Bring up a new long-term view. We made this just for you, Professor Taylor. Semi-log, okay, this needs explanation. This is back to 1981, and then I zoomed it into 1991. That is a 25-year regression, and then I took that red arrow forward. That's the glide path of how we feel we should be with our per capita disposable income. And that's a really solid trend until the last 3 or 4 years. John Taylor, how do we get our real personal disposable income back on track? What do we need to do to get back to that feeling that we had in 2005 and 6?
Well, there's two things. First, get the recovery going. We still have unemployment over 9%, so there's a big gap to fill, right? And then second, get productivity growth up. Now, the news there is pretty good. Since '96, we've had 2.8% productivity growth. So those two things together, Tom, would get us on the right track and back to the kind of good numbers you'd like to have.
So you want to see employment back. Would you support Paul Krugman and the idea of some form of policy or overt action to at least jumpstart to a lower unemployment rate?
No, I think that's what we've been trying to do for the last 2+ years. We have had stimulus package and different types of actions by the Fed. I think what we've learned from this, and I think we learned it long ago, quite frankly, is that you got to get back to really sound policy, sound monetary policy. Some really substantive actions on this debt issue would, I think, be a stimulus on its own. So that's what I'd suggest, Tom.
John, critically, Al Broadus, former president of the Richmond Fed, and Brad DeLong of Berkeley, I don't think they agree on too much besides Giants baseball, but they both agree that if interest rates start up, a central bank can get out in front of that trend and become restrictive and responsibly restrictive quickly. Do you agree with Al Broadus and Brad DeLong that we can be patient here and then get in front of higher rates?
Obviously, you can be too aggressive, but I don't see that as the problem right now. I basically see this really strong need to stop all these interventions, stop all these special things, you know, delaying this move, doing something different. We had a good policy that worked for quite a while in the 80s and 90s until relatively recently. I think that's what I get from looking at history. And that's the most important thing for me. So don't worry about overdoing it on the debt talks. Don't worry about overdoing it on the monetary strategy. It's so important to restore sound policy in both dimensions.
Here's a chart that your colleague Ed Lazier knows. Bring this up: a financial crisis, plunge back to the 1980s employment to population ratio. I mean, John, you have to admit it's been a remarkable jump condition the last 4 years in our unemployed.
Yeah, basically, employment population peaked in year 2000, I believe. Can't see your chart that clearly, but that means how great an opportunity there is to get people back to work. You basically could have an extra % of growth for the next 10 years, just bringing employment up to that same level relative to the population. So it shows to me there's a great opportunity here.
What would you like to see, very quickly here, what would you like to see out of the Obama administration right now? What's a single thing they could take from John Taylor right now? Actionable.
Yeah, show leadership in these debt talks right now. Agree to the spending reductions over 10 years, 2.5%, 2.5 trillion. Get close to what's being proposed. I think that would be a tremendous boom. You do it gradually, you do it credibly. Lay it out there.
Right.
One of the pieces you referred to is FDR did something early in his administration to bring some of these spending items under control, but it did show a great deal of leadership, and I think that's what would be most important right now.
And there's that key word from John Taylor, looking for a credible fiscal response. Thank you, Professor Taylor.